In the late 1990s, Dennis Kozlowski was not just a corporate leader, he was a symbol of the American dream's most seductive version. As chief executive of Tyco International, a global conglomerate producing everything from medical equipment to security systems, he commanded billions in revenue and the loyalty of investors who believed he could turn anything he touched into gold. Behind that success, however, was a world built on illusion, greed, and unchecked indulgence. Kozlowski's rise was meteoric. He came from modest beginnings in New Jersey and climbed through the ranks by projecting confidence that bordered on charisma. He spoke of efficiency, innovation, and the Tyco way, a creed that promised limitless growth. But as his empire expanded, so did his appetite. What began as business ambition evolved into something closer to obsession. He saw himself not as a steward of shareholders' money, but as the star of his own corporate monarchy. The spending was staggering. His Fifth Avenue apartment became a palace of extravagance. Marble floors, a shower curtain costing thousands, and a birthday party for his wife that would become infamous. A bohemian celebration disguised as a shareholder meeting, complete with ice sculptures of Michelangelo's David pouring vodka. Employees joked that Tyco was less a company and more a kingdom. Kozlowski ruled it with charm and intimidation in equal measure. Inside the boardroom, the red flags multiplied. Lavish bonuses, quietly authorized by Kozlowski and his chief financial officer, were later revealed to be unauthorized millions, siphoned from corporate accounts, labeled as executive perks or forgiven loans. Yet investors remained blind to the warning signs. The company's stock price soared, and analysts called Kozlowski a genius. Success, after all, is the best disguise greed can wear. When investigators finally began asking questions, the facade unraveled fast. A routine review uncovered financial irregularities, tens of millions unaccounted for. Prosecutors described an empire of theft, luxury art, purchased with corporate funds, bonuses signed off without board approval, and personal expenses hidden in the books. The man who once stood as a titan of capitalism became its cautionary tale. As cameras followed his walk into court, Kozlowski smiled faintly, the same grin that had once convinced Wall Street he was untouchable. He called the charges exaggerated, insisted the board knew everything, and claimed he was simply rewarded for success. But when jurors saw footage of the extravagant parties and the invoices that read like royal decrees, the myth collapsed. The verdict transformed him from mogul to symbol. He was sentenced to prison for grand larceny and securities fraud. His empire dismantled. His name synonymous with executive excess. The Tyco scandal became a defining story of an era when CEOs believed themselves above consequence. In the end, the tragedy of Dennis Kozlowski wasn't that he wanted wealth. It was that he mistook wealth for worth. The man who had everything proved that power without restraint always ends the same way. Behind bars, counting the cost of his own illusion. By the early 2000s, the illusion surrounding Dennis Kozlowski was cracking. For years, he had walked the marble floors of Tyco International, like a monarch in a tailored suit, the kind of leader who made shareholders richer and the press adore him. But beneath the charm and corporate success was a pattern of greed, too vast to hide forever. When investigators began examining Tyco's internal finances, what they uncovered read more like a royal ledger than a company's balance sheet. Kozlowski had approved millions of dollars in unauthorized bonuses, forgiven loans to himself and top executives, and charged personal luxuries to the company. Every detail painted a picture of excess. Multi-million-dollar paintings billed as decorative assets, a Manhattan apartment filled with imported marble, and a party in the Bahamas that masqueraded as a business meeting complete with dancers and floating vodka sculptures. The deeper auditors looked, the more the mask slipped. Kozlowski, once celebrated as a visionary, became the face of unchecked corporate power. Prosecutors argued that he used Tyco as a personal bank, siphoning funds while investors were told the company was thriving. His defense insisted the board approved everything, that his lifestyle reflected success, not theft. But jurors saw something else, a man who believed his position made him untouchable. The trial became national theater. Cameras followed every step, from the polished courtroom speeches to the infamous evidence displays showing extravagant receipts and gifts. Kozlowski's calm confidence, once his greatest asset, now seemed hollow. When he took the stand, he spoke about loyalty and vision, but each testimony from former employees chipped away at his credibility. The empire he built on perception was collapsing in real time. When the verdict came, it echoed far beyond Tyco. Kozlowski was convicted of grand larceny, conspiracy, and securities fraud, sentenced to prison, and ordered to repay millions. His fall became a turning point in public discourse, proof that even the highest boardroom could breed corruption when oversight failed. In interviews years later, he tried to rewrite the story, calling it a misunderstanding of compensation. But the public had already made up its mind. For ordinary employees whose jobs had vanished in the scandal's aftermath, it wasn't about numbers, it was betrayal. Their leader had promised innovation but delivered collapse. The story of Denis Kozlowski marked the end of an era when corporate kings could rule unchecked. And as his cell door closed, Wall Street whispered a lesson that still lingers. The higher the tower of ego, the greater the fall when truth finally cuts through the gold. Every week, we uncover cases that defies logic. Behind each episode are hours of research, scripting, and editing to make sure every detail you hear is true. What you're watching isn't entertainment. It's real documentary work that remembers the victims and exposes the silence around them. Hit subscribe. It's free for you, but it helps us keep investigating, narrating, and preserving the stories the world would rather erase. At the dawn of the new millennium, Bernard Ebbers stood as one of the most admired business leaders in America. A tall, soft-spoken man with a preacher's cadence, he had built WorldCom from a small Mississippi long-distance provider into a global telecommunications powerhouse. Investors saw him as a visionary, a man who could take on corporate giants and win. To many on Wall Street, he was proof that small-town grit could outsmart the system. But beneath the polished image of humility was a financial empire built on deception, one that would collapse in spectacular fashion. WorldCom's rise was dizzying. Through aggressive acquisitions, Ebbers expanded the company into one of the largest telecoms in the world. Absorbing competitors at a relentless pace, every new merger meant more market share, more headlines, and more faith from investors. But as the boom of the late 1990s began to fade, cracks appeared in the foundation. WorldCom's growth was slowing, debts were mounting, and analysts were asking uncomfortable questions. For a man who measured his worth by Wall Street's applause, that was unacceptable. Inside the company, pressure to meet expectations became unbearable. Ebbers and his chief financial officer allegedly devised a plan, a vast accounting fraud that would hide billions in expenses, inflating profits that didn't exist. Using simple but devastating tricks, they reclassified routine costs as investments, making losses look like growth. On paper, WorldCom looked unstoppable. In reality, it was rotting from the inside. Employees began to notice strange irregularities, but fear kept them quiet. Ebbers was revered like a folk hero, a boss who preached loyalty and faith. Questioning him felt like betrayal. When internal auditors finally uncovered the truth, the numbers were staggering: over $11 billion in falsified earnings, one of the largest frauds in corporate history. The revelation wiped out thousands of jobs, billions in pensions, and the life savings of everyday investors. In 2005, Bernard Ebbers faced trial. His defense team painted him as a businessman, misled by subordinates, claiming he was unaware of the details. But jurors saw a pattern of control, a man who demanded blind obedience, then denied responsibility when the illusion broke. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy and sentenced to 25 years in prison. WorldCom's bankruptcy sent shockwaves through the economy, destroying trust in the corporate world at a time already shaken by the Enron scandal. The man who once stood as a symbol of ambition ended up as a warning about ego, deception, and the fragile line between confidence and corruption. Bernard Ebbers died in 2020, still insisting he never meant harm, but his empire's collapse remains a monument to how one man's denial dressed in faith and authority can destroy the livelihoods of millions. In the end, it wasn't just numbers that failed. It was integrity, sacrificed at the altar of growth. In the sharp-edged world of corporate America during the 1990s, few executives commanded fear and fascination quite like Albert J. Dunlap, a man so ruthless with layoffs and restructuring that Wall Street nicknamed him Chainsaw Al. He built his legend by cutting costs with surgical brutality and promising shareholders miracles. To his admirers, he was the ultimate turnaround artist. To his employees, he was the executioner in a suit. And to history, he became the embodiment of how ego and greed can turn business strategy into moral bankruptcy. Dunlap's rise began with bold charisma. He carried himself like a general ready for war, walking into failing companies and vowing to rebuild them from ashes. He boasted of firing thousands to save millions, insisting that business is not a social welfare institution. The media loved him. He graced magazine covers, wrote bestsellers, and was celebrated as a corporate savior. But behind the sound bites and headlines, his victories came at an unspoken cost. Inflated numbers, broken trust, and a toxic obsession with appearances over truth. When Dunlap took control of Sunbeam Products in the mid-1990s, he promised an aggressive revival. Within months, he slashed entire divisions, closed plants, and dismissed half the workforce. The stock soared. Investors hailed him as the man who could turn anything into profit. But inside the company, accountants noticed something strange: earnings that didn't add up, projections that seemed too perfect, and warehouses filling with unsold inventory. To keep the illusion alive, executives allegedly manipulated financial statements, recording future sales as current income. The deception couldn't last. As the truth leaked, Sunbeam's market value evaporated almost overnight. Auditors uncovered that much of the turnaround had been a mirage, a masterpiece of creative accounting rather than genuine recovery. Dunlap, once celebrated as a savior, was ousted and later charged by the Securities and Exchange Commission for massive fraud. His defense was defiant. He denied wrongdoing, claiming the downfall was caused by disloyal subordinates and overreaction from regulators. But the numbers told a different story. Millions lost, pensions destroyed, and a company's legacy reduced to rubble. The collapse of Sunbeam became a warning to every boardroom in America. It wasn't just about one man's greed, it was about a culture that rewarded illusion over integrity. Dunlap's reign proved that charisma can blind the market, and that fear can silence truth until it's too late. Years later, when asked if he regretted anything, Dunlap famously said, "I wish I'd fired more people faster." Those words sealed his legacy, not as a visionary, but as a cautionary figure. Chainsaw Al carved his name into history by cutting too deep. His empire, built on numbers and nerve, became a monument to the cost of treating people and ethics as expendable. Albert J. Dunlap had built his reputation as the corporate world's executioner, the man who turned failing companies into profit machines by cutting ruthlessly and moving fast. But by the late 1990s, the myth of Chainsaw Al was starting to crack. When he took over Sunbeam Products, it was meant to be his masterpiece, the comeback story that would crown him as America's boldest CEO. Instead, it became the stage for one of the decade's most infamous corporate scandals. From the moment Dunlap entered Sunbeam's headquarters, fear replaced trust. He demanded instant obedience, firing thousands, closing plants, and scrapping entire product lines with a single phone call. Wall Street applauded the chaos. The company's stock price soared, and Dunlap was hailed as a genius. But inside the company, accountants whispered that the numbers didn't make sense. Sales appeared to rise even when warehouses were full of unsold appliances. Revenue seemed to appear from nowhere. It was the illusion of success, carefully orchestrated through accounting tricks, that shifted losses into the future and disguised failure as growth. Behind the curtain, Dunlap ruled through intimidation. Executives who questioned his methods were dismissed or humiliated. "You're either with me or gone," he told one subordinate. For a while, it worked. Analysts were dazzled, and magazines celebrated him as the savior of Sunbeam. But by 1998, the illusion shattered. A major stock collapse exposed the fragile empire he'd built. Investigators found evidence that profits had been inflated by millions through manipulated sales, a scheme that turned Sunbeam's turnaround story into a lie. The company fell into bankruptcy, wiping out investors and pension funds alike. Dunlap, once a fixture of business conferences and television interviews, suddenly became a symbol of greed and hubris. Regulators charged him with fraud and misleading investors, forcing him to pay millions in penalties and banning him from serving as an officer of any public company again. Even after the downfall, Dunlap never admitted guilt. He continued to appear in interviews, railing against what he called corporate hypocrisy, blaming everyone but himself. But the myth of the infallible CEO had died with him. His story was more than one man's downfall, it was a turning point. Sunbeam's collapse forced regulators and investors to question the cult of the celebrity executive, the dangerous belief that charisma could replace ethics, and that results mattered more than reality. When Dunlap passed away in 2019, some called him a tragic figure, a man destroyed by the very legend he created. But to thousands of employees left jobless, and to shareholders whose savings vanished, his legacy was something darker. Proof that when power goes unchecked and fear replaces accountability, even the brightest empire can rot from within. When the truth finally surfaced, Albert J. Dunlap's empire began to unravel faster than even he could spin the story. Sunbeam's boardroom, once the stage for his swaggering confidence, turned into a chamber of disbelief. The numbers, long praised by analysts, were unmasked as illusions. Behind the curtain of efficiency and innovation lay accounting maneuvers so bold they bordered on fiction. Dunlap had been promising a revolution. What he delivered instead was financial carnage. In early 1998, Sunbeam's auditors found the discrepancies impossible to ignore. Sales were being recorded months in advance. Revenues that hadn't yet existed were booked to inflate quarterly performance. The company had essentially created a paper empire, one built on pretense, intimidation, and spin. When the financial press caught wind, panic spread. The stock price, once a symbol of Dunlap's genius, collapsed. Investors who had worshipped his confidence were now staring at their losses in disbelief. The man who had once strutted through television studios now faced a new audience, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Investigators accused him of deliberately misleading shareholders and manipulating Sunbeam's books to secure his own fortune. Dunlap denied everything, calling the allegations corporate politics. But the evidence spoke louder than his bravado. The SEC imposed fines, banned him from ever serving as an officer of a public company again, and stripped away the remnants of his reputation. His personal fall was steep. The mansion, the private jets, the book, deals, all symbols of his rise, now looked like relics of arrogance. Yet even in disgrace, Dunlap remained defiant. In interviews, he mocked his critics, claiming they couldn't handle success. He never admitted fault, never apologized to the thousands who lost their livelihoods when Sunbeam imploded. To him, the world had simply turned against greatness. But to the public, his story became a lesson in unchecked power, a warning that fear-driven leadership corrodes everything it touches. Dunlap had ruled through intimidation, cutting away people and ethics with the same precision he once used to trim costs. He believed he was creating efficiency. In reality, he was erasing humanity from business. Years later, when business schools studied the Sunbeam disaster, they didn't focus on financial strategy, they focused on psychology. How charisma turned into control. How the myth of results at any cost blinded investors, employees, and regulators alike. Dunlap's empire collapsed not because of a single lie, but because an entire culture of fear allowed those lies to thrive unchecked. When he died in 2019, the world barely noticed. No grand tributes, no corporate eulogies. Just a footnote in business history, the man who proved that power without restraint always ends the same way. In silence, scandal, and the ruins of what once looked unstoppable. In the polished world of pharmaceutical boardrooms, Martin Shkreli didn't fit the mold. He wasn't born into money or power, he built his empire through audacity, controversy, and a sharp understanding of how markets could be bent without breaking. By the early 2010s, Shkreli had transformed himself from a hedge fund analyst into one of the most notorious executives in modern medicine. His name became synonymous with greed, arrogance, and the cold manipulation of human need. It started with a single drug, Daraprim, a decades-old medication used to treat a life-threatening parasitic infection. When Shkreli's company, Turing Pharmaceuticals, acquired the rights in 2015, he made a decision that would define his legacy. Overnight, the price jumped from $13.50 to $750 per pill. For patients, hospitals, and HIV advocates, the outrage was immediate. To them, it wasn't strategy, it was cruelty. To Shkreli, it was business. He defended the move on television with a smirk, claiming he was simply maximizing shareholder value. That smirk became infamous. As public fury grew, Shkreli leaned into it, taunting critics online, mocking politicians, even calling himself the world's most hated man. But while the outrage focused on the price hike, a deeper storm was brewing behind the scenes. Federal investigators were examining his hedge fund history, and what they found turned public disgust into criminal prosecution. Shkreli was charged with securities fraud, accused of misleading investors in his former hedge funds and using money from one company to quietly pay off the losses of another. It wasn't about the drug price anymore, it was about deception, arrogance, and the illusion of genius that had fooled so many. During the trial, he sat stone-faced, sometimes smirking, sometimes mocking the proceedings. The jury saw through the act. He was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison, stripped of his fortune and barred from the pharmaceutical industry. Even then, he refused to apologize. "I don't think I did anything wrong," he said in interviews. "I made money. That's what business is." But the world had already decided otherwise. Shkreli's name became shorthand for unchecked greed, proof that profit without empathy can destroy more than reputation. It can erode trust in the entire system. His downfall wasn't just legal, it was symbolic. He exposed the moral vacuum inside an industry that profits from pain. When he was finally released, his legacy lingered like a warning label. The price of arrogance, written in billions of dollars, and the suffering of patients who couldn't afford the medicine he turned into a luxury. Charles Keating was once celebrated as a visionary banker, the kind of man who mixed moral rhetoric with financial ambition. He presented himself as a crusader for integrity, a man who fought pornography, preached virtue, and claimed to defend the average American investor. But behind that image, in the glittering offices of Lincoln Savings and Loan during the 1980s, Keating was quietly engineering one of the most disastrous financial collapses in US history. At the height of his power, Keating transformed Lincoln Savings and Loan into a monument to excess. He poured customer deposits into speculative real estate ventures, and junk bonds risky. High-return bets that defied the conservative nature of a savings institution. The profits looked impressive on paper, and Keating's empire expanded across Arizona, California, and beyond. His charisma and political influence kept regulators at bay, while thousands of retirees invested their life savings into what they believed was a safe, community-backed financial institution. But underneath the marble floors and golden promises, Lincoln was rotting. The company's assets were collapsing under the weight of bad investments. By 1989, the truth could no longer be hidden. More than $2 billion had vanished. Families who trusted Keating lost everything. Retirement funds evaporated. Homes were foreclosed. The collapse didn't just destroy one company, it helped ignite the nationwide savings and loan crisis, a catastrophe that would cost American taxpayers more than $100 billion. As the scandal unraveled, so did Keating's moral facade. Investigators revealed that he had used political connections, including 5 U.S. senators later dubbed the Keating Five, to pressure regulators into looking the other way. The image of virtue he'd cultivated turned into a symbol of corruption. Keating was convicted of fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. He served several years in prison before portions of his conviction were overturned and later repleaded in a reduced settlement. Even after his release, he remained defiant, claiming he had been made a scapegoat for a broken system. But for the thousands who lost their savings, his name became synonymous with betrayal, a man who weaponized trust and morality to disguise greed. Keating's story wasn't just a tale of one corrupt banker. It marked the beginning of a national reckoning about deregulation, political influence, and the human cost of financial manipulation. He showed how easily ideals could be sold as products, and how, in the pursuit of profit, even the language of morality can be twisted into a tool for exploitation. By the time Keating died in 2014, the world had moved on to new scandals, new faces of greed. But his shadow lingered, the man who turned savings into loss, trust into tragedy, and morality into marketing. In the marble halls of Lincoln Savings and Loan, Charles Keating's story had already shaken the foundations of American finance, but in its aftermath, the seeds of unchecked ambition kept spreading. The 1980s were an age of excess, where power meant prestige and morality was just a marketing word. Into that atmosphere stepped a new kind of executive, ruthless, visionary, and utterly detached from consequence. The Wall Street Revolution had begun, and behind every glittering skyscraper lay boardrooms where bosses believed they were gods of the economy. At the heart of that decade's fever stood figures like Keating, who preached ethics while quietly weaponizing greed. He wasn't alone. The world was changing, and executives across the United States were realizing something profound. With deregulation, charisma, and the right political friends, you could build an empire overnight and destroy thousands of lives just as fast. Keating became a symbol not just of corruption, but of how leadership could curdle into tyranny. His power extended beyond his company. He had senators, lobbyists, even church leaders echoing his praise. To the outside world, he was a man of virtue, a devout Catholic, a family man, a pillar of his community. But for the investors who trusted him, that image was a mask. When Lincoln Savings collapsed, retirees saw their entire life savings vanish. Families who had believed in him as a man of faith and stability now faced foreclosure and ruin. The trial that followed wasn't only about one man's crimes. It was about an entire era's philosophy, the belief that profit justified everything. In court, Keating's calm arrogance never faltered. He saw himself as the victim of government persecution, a scapegoat for a system that had quietly encouraged his risk-taking. But every number on the balance sheet told a different story, one of deception, inflated assets, and human cost. His conviction became a headline symbolizing the collapse of corporate virtue. Journalists called it the death of trust, and regulators began questioning how so many could have ignored the warning signs. But even as Keating faded from public view, his shadow stretched across the next generation of corporate frauds from Enron to Lehman Brothers. His methods, his manipulation of regulation, and his misuse of moral language became a template for future scandals. By the time he passed in 2014, Keating's name was already part of business folklore, a reminder that the greatest danger isn't theft or fraud alone, but the illusion of righteousness that hides behind it. His empire was built on a promise of safety and faith. It collapsed under the weight of its own lies. In the end, Lincoln Savings wasn't just a financial tragedy. It was a warning that every system, no matter how noble in design, is only as moral as the people who lead it. And when those leaders mistake power for purpose, even the most trusted institutions can become engines of ruin. By the dawn of the 1990s, the collapse of Lincoln Savings and Loan had become more than just a financial disaster, it was a moral reckoning. The savings and loan crisis rippled through the nation like a storm, exposing how unrestrained greed and political favoritism could bring an entire economic system to its knees. Charles Keating wasn't just another corrupt banker. He was the face of a new kind of corporate villain, one who cloaked ambition behind virtue, using his charm and faith as camouflage for deceit. The aftermath was brutal. Hundreds of small investors, retirees, widows, and families discovered their savings were gone. The numbers were staggering, but the faces behind them were worse. People who had trusted the word savings because it promised safety. Keating's name became a curse in households across America, and his trial drew crowds like a televised spectacle. Prosecutors laid out how he had funneled customer deposits into personal luxuries and speculative real estate deals. There were private jets, desert mansions, and a paper empire built on empty promises. His defense rested on a simple idea that the government, not him, had failed. He called himself a victim of changing regulations, a businessman punished for playing by rules that no longer existed. But jurors didn't buy it. The jury saw through his sanctimonious tone, through the sermons about free enterprise and personal liberty. They saw a man who had gambled with the livelihoods of others and lost without remorse. His conviction came down not only as a legal judgment, but as a cultural one, a symbol that unchecked power, no matter how respectable it looks, corrodes everything it touches. Yet even as Keating sat in prison, his influence lingered. The Keating Five, the senators accused of intervening on his behalf, revealed how deep the rot had spread. Politics and business had fused into something toxic, and reformers began calling for stronger financial oversight. But those reforms came too late for millions who had already lost everything. Keating's downfall didn't end the greed, it merely changed its face. The lessons of the savings and loan crisis faded as newer scandals. Enron, Lehman Brothers, FTX followed the same script decades later. Different names, different tools, but the same human flaw: the belief that profit justifies betrayal. When Keating died in 2014, his obituary split the nation. Some called him a visionary undone by overregulation. Others called him a predator who used faith to mask fraud. The truth was simpler: he was a man who confused power for righteousness, a leader who believed that wealth was proof of virtue. And in that confusion, he taught the world one lasting lesson. When leaders preach morality but practice greed, it's not just money that disappears, it's trust. The foundation of every system meant to protect us. In the early years of the new millennium, London was humming with optimism. The financial sector was booming, the city's skyline stretching higher each year, and a generation of civic leaders promised progress through diversity and inclusion. Among those figures stood Lee Jasper, a man whose name became synonymous with ambition, advocacy, and eventually controversy. Jasper's rise was meteoric. As an advisor and community leader, he projected confidence and authority, claiming to stand for fairness and transparency. To his supporters, he was the face of a modern Britain, a voice for those historically excluded from power. To his critics, he represented the blurring of lines between activism and politics, between influence and accountability. That tension would soon explode into scandal. Reports began to surface, suggesting that public grants meant for community initiatives had been mishandled, misdirected toward organizations tied to Jasper's network. The numbers were small compared to corporate frauds dominating the headlines, yet the symbolism was devastating. A man who had built his reputation on trust and equality now stood accused of bending the system to benefit his allies. What made the situation worse wasn't just the alleged misuse of funds, it was the culture of silence that surrounded it. Officials hesitated to investigate, fearing political fallout. Each revelation in the press drew sharper reactions from the public. Supporters said Jasper was being targeted because of his race and outspoken nature. Detractors said he had become another powerful figure hiding behind idealism. The scandal revealed something far larger than one man's mistakes. It exposed how easily moral authority can be converted into personal leverage, and how noble causes can become convenient shields. Within months, pressure mounted. Jasper resigned from his official post, denying any criminal wrongdoing but acknowledging that his position had become untenable. In televised interviews, he appeared calm, even defiant, speaking about betrayal by the institutions he once served. The words carried an edge of tragedy. A man who had dedicated himself to reform now branded as part of the problem. Investigations eventually found insufficient evidence to prosecute, yet the damage was done. Reputations, once built on moral integrity, rarely survive the hint of impropriety. Years later, analysts still debated whether Jasper's downfall was a case of genuine corruption or a political setup. Either way, it left a scar on public trust. For citizens, it became another reminder that charisma often clouds judgment. For institutions, it was a warning that ideals must be guarded as carefully as assets. By the end of the decade, the story had faded from front pages, but its lesson endured. Power, whether in business, politics, or activism, always tempts those who hold it. And when leaders forget that accountability is the foundation of service, the very communities they claim to defend become their victims. In the glowing world of Silicon Valley, Elizabeth Holmes appeared to be the next great visionary. Barely out of her teens, dressed in black turtlenecks and speaking in deliberate tones, she introduced herself as the woman who would revolutionize healthcare. Her company, Theranos, promised something miraculous. A single drop of blood could run hundreds of tests, diagnosing illnesses faster, cheaper, and more accurately than ever before. Investors, politicians, and media outlets crowned her the next Steve Jobs. They didn't see the cracks forming beneath the polished surface. From its earliest days, Theranos was built on secrecy. Employees were divided into isolated teams, told to trust the mission but never question the process. Holmes radiated confidence, convincing even seasoned experts that skepticism was disloyalty. Laboratories were hidden behind tinted glass. Demonstrations for investors were choreographed performances. Behind the curtain, engineers and lab scientists whispered the truth the technology didn't work. Machines failed. Tests produced wild inaccuracies, and patient samples were quietly rerouted to traditional analyzers. The deception grew into a self-sustaining illusion. With billions in valuation and former US officials on its board, Theranos had become too big to doubt. Doctors began ordering tests. Patients received results that could alter their treatment or shatter their peace of mind. Yet many of those results were fiction. The stakes were no longer financial, they were human. Inside the company, dissent was punished, loyalty rewarded, and silence demanded. Employees who questioned Holmes's claims found themselves isolated, fired, or threatened with lawsuits. It all began to unravel when whistleblowers contacted a journalist from the Wall Street Journal. The ensuing investigation peeled back the layers of myth surrounding Holmes and her enigmatic empire. What emerged was not a story of innovation, but of manipulation of a leader who built a culture where image outweighed truth, and where idealism mutated into obsession. When federal regulators stepped in, the illusion collapsed overnight. Clinics severed contracts, investors fled, and Theranos was exposed as a billion-dollar fraud. Holmes was charged with defrauding investors and patients alike. In court, she maintained that she had never intended harm, that her faith in the technology blinded her to its failure. But the evidence told another story, one of willful deception, carefully crafted illusions, and a relentless pursuit of glory. Her conviction years later marked the fall of an icon. The same press that once celebrated her now used her name as shorthand for corporate delusion. But beyond the scandal, Holmes became a mirror, reflecting Silicon Valley's darkest truth, that in the race to disrupt, morality is often the first casualty. For every visionary who changes the world, there are others who build castles on promises, sustained not by invention but by belief. Theranos was never just a company. It was a modern fable about trust and how easily it can be sold. She entered the story as a star, barely out of her teens, donning black turtlenecks and speaking in prophetic tones. Elizabeth Holmes promised to revolutionize medicine. Her startup claimed it could run hundreds of blood tests from a single drop. Investors bought into the dream, tipping billions. But the dream had a dark underside, and the sooner it unraveled, the heavier the fall. Holmes founded her company in 2003, and word spread fast. Venture capital flowed. Prominent figures lined up: politicians, generals, secretaries of state. The boardroom was dazzling. The promise was seductive. But behind closed doors, scientists saw cracks. Machines failed. Results drifted. Whispers spread. This technology might not work as claimed. Inside the gleaming headquarters, employees spoke of secrecy. Teams were isolated. Dissent was discouraged. Holmes's charisma and control created a bubble insulated from reality. On the surface, she spoke of saving lives, democratizing healthcare. Beneath it, she curbed questions, discouraged independent testing, and rewarded loyalty above accuracy. The turning point came in the mid-2000s teens when journalists and regulators began probing the claims. Investigations revealed that the signature device never performed reliably. Patient reports were inconsistent. Machines designed in-house were bypassed in favor of older commercial systems, yet investors were told otherwise. The illusion collapsed. In the federal courtroom in early 2022, Holmes faced the consequences of the deception. The jury found her guilty on multiple counts of fraud. Investors had been misled. She was sentenced to over 11 years in prison and ordered to pay hundreds of millions in restitution. Despite her youth, her conviction transformed her from visionary to textbook case of hubris. Holmes's story was more than a fall from grace. It became a warning to the world of innovation. In the race to disrupt, truth was sidelined. In the hunger for fame, ethics were ignored. The boardroom lights flickered. The turtleneck still remembered, but the technology never delivered. And the lives that trusted the promise were left to wonder how the miracle machine had betrayed them. When she walked away from the courtroom, the halo shimmered and faded. In its place, a cautionary legend about ambition unmoored, control unchecked, and the price paid when trust becomes the product, and leaders forget the people behind the numbers. Carlos Ghosn's name once stood for triumph in the global auto industry. The son of Lebanese parents, educated in France and revered in Japan, he had united three automotive giants, Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi, into one of the most powerful alliances in the world. To admirers, he was the modern industrial savior, the man who resurrected dying companies through discipline, efficiency, and daring reform. But beneath the polished exterior of boardroom brilliance, Ghosn's empire was quietly built on control, secrecy, and the slow corrosion of accountability. During the late 2000s, whispers began to circulate inside Nissan. Executive expenses were ballooning. Corporate housing in multiple countries, Paris, Rio de Janeiro, Beirut, Tokyo, had been purchased or renovated under questionable circumstances. Private jets were routinely used for personal trips. Still, Gozan's success insulated him from suspicion. He had saved the company once before. No one wanted to question the man who had made billions for shareholders. By late 2018, the illusion finally cracked. Japanese prosecutors arrested Gozan upon landing in Tokyo, accusing him of underreporting income and misusing company assets. His arrest sent shockwaves through the global economy, an unprecedented fall for a man so powerful. In interviews, Nissan insiders described an executive who ruled like royalty, insulated from criticism, his decisions rarely challenged. For decades, he had been untouchable. Suddenly, he was behind bars. Ghosn denied all wrongdoing. He claimed he was the victim of a corporate coup, punished for trying to merge Nissan and Renault into a single global entity. He insisted that the board, not him, had approved the compensation structures, and that cultural politics in Japan had made him an outsider. Yet, as investigations expanded, the pattern became harder to ignore. Layers of shell companies, hidden payments, and perks quietly authorized in his name. Then came the act that stunned the world. In December of 2019, while on bail and awaiting trial, Ghosn vanished. Within hours, news broke that he had fled Japan. The story sounded impossible. The former CEO smuggled onto a private jet inside a large equipment case, flown first to Turkey, then to Lebanon, a country with no extradition treaty. What had begun as a financial scandal now read like a thriller. Safe in Beirut, Ghosn held press conferences, declaring himself a fugitive from injustice. Cameras captured his anger, his wounded pride. To his supporters, he was a man wronged by bureaucracy. To critics, his escape confirmed everything they suspected, that he believed rules were for others. The empire he once built was in ruins. Nissan's alliance fractured, its profits collapsed, and its reputation still carries the scars. Ghosn's story became a parable of modern capitalism. How brilliance, unchecked by humility, can evolve into delusion. Even in exile, his name remains a cautionary echo, proof that when power crosses borders faster than the law, truth often becomes the first casualty. In the end, Carlos Ghosn didn't just flee a country, he fled accountability itself. At the height of Enron's empire, Jeff Skilling was hailed as a genius. He wasn't the kind of CEO who inherited a dynasty, he built one from ambition, intellect, and an unshakable belief in his own ideas. Under his leadership, Enron transformed from a struggling pipeline company into a symbol of modern capitalism. Skilling promised to revolutionize the energy market through innovation and deregulation. To Wall Street, he was a hero, confident, articulate, and fearless. To those inside the company, he was something else entirely, the architect of a culture that worshipped profit above truth. The late 1990s were Enron's golden years. Skilling's mark-to-market accounting system allowed the company to record potential future profits as if they already existed. On paper, that made Enron unstoppable. In reality, it was smoke and mirrors, a financial mirage designed to please investors and inflate stock prices. Executives became addicted to the illusion. Departments hid losses inside complex shell companies, and employees who questioned the system were quietly pushed aside. Inside the Houston headquarters, the atmosphere was electric, but toxic. Employees were told to rank and yank, a brutal evaluation system that fired the lowest performers each quarter. Success meant loyalty, and loyalty meant silence. Every quarter brought new celebrations, new profits, and higher bonuses, none of which were real. The numbers were an act of faith, and Skilling was the high priest. When journalists began asking questions, Enron doubled down. Skilling famously lashed out at analysts who doubted the numbers, calling one an A** hole during a conference call. He was daring the world to challenge him. But the math couldn't hold forever. In late 2001, the balance sheets finally cracked. Enron's stock plummeted from over $90 to less than $1. Thousands of employees lost their savings, their pensions, and their trust in corporate leadership. Skilling resigned just weeks before the collapse, claiming stress. Soon after, federal investigators uncovered the massive accounting fraud beneath Enron's empire. The so-called smartest guys in the room had built their fortune on deceit. Skilling's trial became a national spectacle, an indictment not just of one company, but of an era obsessed with image over integrity. In 2006, he was convicted of fraud, insider trading, and conspiracy. The once celebrated CEO was sentenced to 24 years in prison, later reduced after appeals. His downfall marked the end of Enron and the beginning of stricter corporate laws, including the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Years later, Skilling would claim he never intended harm, that Enron's failure was a tragedy of optimism gone wrong. But the truth remains simpler. When ambition outpaces accountability, collapse is inevitable. Enron's slogan had once been, "Ask why." Ironically, that was the very question no one inside dared to ask until it was far too late. In the shimmering world of modern technology, success often hides behind a screen of innovation. Sam Wojtowicz, a name once whispered with admiration in Silicon Valley circles, embodied that illusion perfectly. He was the archetype of the modern founder, a man who spoke fluently about disruption, empowerment, and digital freedom, while quietly bending the system to his own will. Wojtowicz built his startup on the promise of transparency. His company designed software for corporate analytics, claiming to give employees and investors real-time insight into stock performance and executive accountability. It was irony of the highest order. While preaching openness, Wojtowicz concealed a labyrinth of insider trades and backdated stock options that inflated his wealth and misled the very people who believed in him. The scandal began, as these stories often do, with whispers. Analysts noticed irregularities in the firm's quarterly reports, timing coincidences that always seemed to favor the CEO. When federal regulators began investigating, they uncovered a carefully choreographed scheme. Wojtowicz had granted himself and his closest allies stock options dated to moments of low valuation, ensuring windfall profits once the prices rebounded. To investors, this looked like strategic genius. To prosecutors, it looked like fraud. As investigations deepened, a portrait of arrogance emerged. Internal emails revealed contempt for regulators and shareholders alike. "Everyone does it," one message read. It was a familiar defense, echoing through the corridors of every great corporate downfall. He had begun to believe his own myth, that intelligence placed him above consequence, that results justified deception. When the charges were finally announced, the shock was immediate. Employees who had celebrated Wojtowicz as a visionary now found themselves laid off. Their retirement savings slashed as the company's valuation collapsed overnight. The media called it a 21st century Enron, smaller, but just as rotten. In court, Wojtowicz stood defiant, arguing that the case was overblown, that his company's success proved his intent was good. But intent does not erase manipulation. The verdict came swiftly. Convicted on multiple counts of securities fraud and insider trading, he received a sentence that mirrored the era's impatience with corporate deceit. Yet even from prison, Wojtowicz continued to frame himself as misunderstood, a visionary punished for coloring outside the lines. His story may lack the grand scale of Enron or Theranos, but it strikes closer to home in the digital age. It's a reminder that modern fraud wears designer sneakers, speaks in startup jargon, and hides behind dashboards and spreadsheets instead of smoke-filled boardrooms. The tools change, the greed remains timeless. Sam Wojtowicz promised transparency, yet built his empire on concealment. He sold efficiency, yet wasted lives and livelihoods in pursuit of personal gain. And like every boss who mistakes innovation for immunity, he learned too late that technology can't outsmart accountability. Martha Stewart was more than a name, she was an empire. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, she had transformed the art of homemaking into a billion-dollar business. Magazines, cookbooks, television shows, branded homeware, everything she touched sold aspiration. The perfect meal, the perfect home, the perfect life. She was America's domestic goddess, the embodiment of success built through hard work, taste, and poise. But perfection has a price, and Stewart's would come due in a way that no recipe could prepare her for. The first crack appeared quietly in late 2001 as the markets reeled from a collapsing tech bubble. Federal investigators began tracing suspicious trades in the stock of a biotech company called Imclone Systems. The company's founder, a friend of Stewart's, had received advance notice that the Food and Drug Administration would reject one of its key drugs. Before the announcement went public, Stewart sold her shares, avoiding a loss of tens of thousands of dollars. It looked like luck. It smelled like insider trading. At first, she denied everything. Calm and composed, Stewart told reporters she had a standing agreement with her broker to sell once the stock dropped below a certain price. But investigators noticed inconsistencies, phone records, conversations, timing. Her sale came just one day before the devastating announcement. When the truth began to close in, she doubled down. Publicly defiant, she declared her innocence even as the evidence tightened around her. In 2003, federal prosecutors charged her with conspiracy, obstruction, and lying to investigators. It wasn't the profit that doomed her, it was the cover-up. In the courtroom, the woman who once sold image and trust was forced to defend her own credibility. The press treated the trial like a national drama. The same networks that once showcased her flower arrangements now broadcast her downfall in real time. The verdict landed like a thunderclap. Guilty. Stewart was sentenced to 5 months in prison, 5 months of home confinement, and 2 years of probation. For a woman whose brand relied on elegance and control, the humiliation was complete. Yet even behind bars, she refused to fade. She served her sentence quietly, emerged with the same calm confidence, and began rebuilding what she'd lost. Her comeback was almost as remarkable as her fall. Within a few years, Martha Stewart Living was back on store shelves. Her media empire relaunched. But something fundamental had changed. The story of Martha Stewart had become a modern parable not about homemaking, but about hubris. In the boardrooms of corporate America, her name became shorthand for the cost of ignoring compliance. In popular culture, she remained an icon, but one now permanently shadowed by the reminder that no one, not even the queen of perfection, is above the law. Her story endures because it bridges both worlds, the ruthless logic of business and the fragile illusion of image. And when those two collide, even the most polished surface can shatter. Power was supposed to build things, companies, industries, opportunities. But in every story of corporate downfall, power did the opposite. It devoured itself. Across decades and continents, from the marble lobbies of Houston to the glass towers of Tokyo, the pattern repeats. Visionaries who lost their way, innovators who mistook ambition for divinity, executives who believed numbers could rewrite morality. What connects them all isn't greed alone, but belief, the conviction that they were untouchable. The modern corporation became a kind of religion. Its leaders were high priests of profit, reciting balance sheets instead of prayers, promising salvation through growth. Investors, employees, even governments bent to the illusion of success. When a company's valuation soars, no one wants to look beneath the surface. Enron, WorldCom, Theranos, all began as dreams built on disruption. all ended the same way, with handcuffs, lawsuits, and the quiet collapse of trust. These stories aren't just about white-collar crime. They're about the psychology of leadership, how power distorts perspective. Jeff Skilling thought his brilliance justified bending the rules. Elizabeth Holmes believed image mattered more than integrity. Martin Shkreli mocked the very people who relied on his drug, mistaking cruelty for strength. And Martha Stewart, whose empire was built on credibility, learned that reputation means nothing when truth catches up. Every time a boss falls, the world reacts the same way: disbelief, outrage, fascination. But behind every scandal lies a mirror. The system that rewards unchecked ambition creates the very monsters it later condemns. Corporations preach accountability, yet design incentives that punish caution. Investors demand transparency, but reward those who manipulate perception. It's not just the CEOs who break the system, it's the culture that teaches them they must. When the boardroom becomes a battlefield, truth is the first casualty. Data is weaponized. Employees become collateral, and loyalty is traded for silence. The victims aren't only the shareholders or the laid-off staff. They're the millions who once believed that business could be moral, that capitalism could be human. Still, there's something hauntingly human about these downfalls. They remind us that power magnifies whatever already exists inside a person. If they start with greed, it grows into corruption. If they start with insecurity, it mutates into obsession. Power doesn't change character, it reveals it. In the end, every one of these stories returns to the same lesson. Profit without principle is a ticking clock. Sooner or later, the balance sheet explodes and the empire falls. What remains isn't wealth or legacy, only the echo of a warning. Because the real battlefield isn't the market or the courtroom, it's the conscience. And no one, no matter how powerful, wins that war for long.